Abusive ex humiliated her at the dinner night. What the Korean Mafia boss did next shocked everyone. The first thing Amaka noticed wasn't him. It was the silence. The Lagos Cultural Center gala was alive with the sound of clinking crystal and low, polished laughter. The kind of room where power dressed in suits and pretended to be warmth. Amaka stood near the far window, her emerald gown still catching the chandelier light. A glass of wine she hadn't touched in one hand. And then the silence found her. Not the whole room. Just one small pocket of it. The kind that moves through a crowd like a cold current before a storm. She turned. He was there. Standing in the entrance of the grand hall, framed by the archway, was Adekunle. Not a ghost. Not a memory. Real. Present. Watching. He didn't look like someone who had searched for her. He looked like someone who had found what he came for. Unhurried, unworried. Wearing the easy confidence of a man who had never once lost what he considered his. He moved through the crowd the way he always had, parting people without touching them. Eyes lowered around him instinctively. Conversations shifted. Space was made. Amaka didn't move. Her body remembered him faster than her mind did. You thought Seoul was far enough? His voice reached her before he did. Loud enough to carry, quiet enough to seem casual. The conversations nearest to them dissolved. Heads turned. He didn't rush. He picked up a glass of red wine from a passing tray as he walked toward her. Slowly, like he had all the time in the world. You left without saying goodbye, Amaka. He smiled. That was rude. Before she could speak, before she could breathe, his hand moved. The slap turned her head sideways. The sting registered a second late, delayed by shock. And then came the wine. Slow, deliberate, poured from above. Dark red flooding her emerald gown, running into her hair, dripping onto the polished floor. Marking her, owning her, in front of everyone. Everything you are, he said, tightening his fist in the fabric at her shoulder. I made possible. Amaka twisted free. She ran. Through the corridor, past the startled faces and the frozen servers, through the double doors at the far end of the hall, and straight into something that didn't move. Not a wall. A man. Hands caught her, not grabbing, not restraining. Steadying. Firm and certain, like he had been standing there exactly for this. She looked up. Do-yoon looked down at her. His eyes moved from her face, to the wine soaking her gown, to the trembling in her hands, and back up. Something shifted behind those eyes. Something that had no name. Before we go any further, before we get to what Do-yoon did next and why what happened in that room is still being whispered about, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. This story is for everyone who has ever rebuilt themselves from nothing. Now, let's go back. Do-yoon's voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. That was the part that made the nearby guests step back. Not anger, not volume, just a frequency that lived below sound. The kind that told every person in earshot that the man speaking had nothing left to prove and every reason to act. Who did this to you? Amaka could barely find her breath. Adekunle, she said. He's here. The last trace of stillness left Do-yoon's face. What replaced it was not rage. It was finality. If you have ever wondered what happens when the most controlled man in any room stops choosing control, stay with me, because this is that story. But to understand what Do-yoon was willing to do, and why, you need to understand what it cost Amaka to get to that room at all. Because the woman in the emerald gown didn't start there. She started somewhere much smaller, much darker, with nothing but her own hands and a sky she kept looking up at because it was the only thing that had no ceiling. Years before the chandelier, before Seoul, before any of it, there was Lagos, and a girl who used to stop every evening on the way home from her studio, tilt her head back, and look at the open sky. Not praying, just looking. Just reminding herself that some things couldn't be owned. Her name was Amaka, and she was about to learn exactly how wrong she was. Lagos in the dry season had a particular kind of light. Not soft. Not golden the way people described European evenings. Lagos light was direct. It landed on everything without apology, exposing texture, burning color into surfaces, refusing to flatter what didn't deserve flattering. Amaka had grown up under that light, and somewhere along the way it had gotten into her work. She was 24 and studying architecture at Yaba Tech, and her professors called her sketches restless. They didn't mean it as a compliment. But Amaka kept a small notebook, pages soft from use, corners bent, where she drew the buildings she actually wanted to design someday. Not the ones in the textbooks, with their rigid symmetry and their grand facades built to intimidate. Hers had wide corridors, tall windows, courtyards open to the sky. She had a theory, though she had never said it aloud to anyone. She believed that the shape of a space could either imprison the person living inside it or set them free. That architecture was never neutral. Every ceiling either pressed down or lifted. Every doorway either welcomed or warned. The best buildings, she thought, were the ones that made you feel, without a single word, like you were allowed to be there. Her professors called it idealistic. Amaka called it the point. She lived with her mother in a 2-bedroom flat in Surulere, the kind of neighborhood that was always in motion. Hawkers calling from the street below before sunrise, generators humming through the evening, the smell of a goosey soup drifting from 3 different flats at once. Her mother, Ngozi, was a seamstress who had raised Amaka mostly alone after her father relocated to Abuja for work and relocated his loyalty somewhere along the way. Ngozi never said a bad word about him. That, Amaka thought, was a kind of strength she wasn't sure she had inherited. She looked up. He was tall, well-dressed in the particular way that suggested he had not had to think about it. The suit sitting on him the way suits sit on men who have worn them long enough that the clothes simply agree with the body. He had a calm face, not beautiful exactly but settled, like a man who had resolved most of his questions and was no longer troubled by the ones he hadn't. His name was Adekunle. He was 31. He ran import logistics, supply chain solutions, he said, which sounded to Amaka like a sentence built to end conversations about what he actually did. He asked about her work with what felt like genuine curiosity. He listened without redirecting. When she mentioned her theory about spaces and freedom, he didn't call it idealistic. He said, "That's exactly right, actually." Something in Amaka's chest, some small, tired muscle she hadn't realized she'd been clenching, loosened slightly. It was such a small thing. That was what she would think about later. How the unlocking had started with something so small. He called 2 days after the event. He took her to dinner at a restaurant where the menus had no prices. The first time in her life she had sat in a room like that, and he talked about her work more than his own, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. He was not loud, not showy. He had the particular confidence of someone who did not need the room to know he was important. He simply was and waited for the room to figure it out on its own. "You have the kind of mind that gets wasted in firms," he told her. Over dessert she hadn't ordered but appeared anyway. "You should be building your own practice." "I'm 24, she said. "I know," he said. "I'm saying eventually." She walked home that night under the Lego sky and stopped on the pavement the way she always did, head back, looking up. She thought, he sees something in me. She did not yet know that seeing something in a person and wanting to possess it were not always different things. She did not yet know that Adekunle collected things he found valuable. She looked up at the open sky, wide, unbounded, belonging to no one, and breathed. For now it was enough to be seen. It started with kindness. That was the part nobody warned you about. Not the control, the kindness that came first. The kindness so precisely calibrated to the shape of your need that it felt less like generosity and more like finally being understood. Adekunle paid her school fees in November. He didn't announce it. He simply called one Tuesday morning, a Tuesday specifically because he had been paying enough attention to know what Tuesdays meant to her, and told her it had been handled. The outstanding balance she had been quietly renegotiating with the faculty office for 3 weeks. Gone. "You shouldn't have to think about that," he said. "You should be designing." Amaka sat with the phone in her hand for a long time after he hung up. She told herself it was gratitude she felt. It would take her 2 more years to find the right word for what it actually was, the particular vulnerability of being rescued. The way it quietly rearranged the power in a room without either person acknowledging that a room had changed at all. The help continued. Amaka's school fees in January. A new laptop when hers finally surrendered. Envelope, thick, unmarked. left on her studio desk one afternoon with a note that said simply, "For the roof." Her mother accepted it with a grace that broke Amaka's heart a little, because she recognized the expression on Ngozi's face. She had worn it herself at the faculty office. The expression of a person swallowing pride because the alternative was worse. "He's a good man," her mother said. Amaka said nothing. She was beginning to understand that good was a complicated word. The first instruction arrived dressed as concern. They had been together 4 months when Adekunle saw her leaving for a site visit in a pair of wide trousers and a loose blouse. Practical, comfortable, the kind of thing you wore when you were going to spend the afternoon crouching on unfinished floors and measuring wall lengths. "You're wearing that?" he said. Not a command. A question. The inflection perfectly balanced between curiosity and something colder. "It's a site visit," Amaka said. "I know." He smiled. "I just think you could look more put together. People see you and they see my woman. It reflects. My woman." She noted the phrase without examining it. Filed it somewhere she wasn't ready to open yet. She changed. Later, she would identify this as the moment. Not because the clothing mattered, but because she had stood in front of the mirror in different trousers and understood, on some level below language, that she had just answered a question she hadn't been consciously asked. After that, the instructions came more frequently. Still dressed as concern. Still delivered in that measured, reasonable tone that made disagreement feel like overreaction. "Don't go to Chisholm's gathering, those people don't have direction, and you absorb energy from your environment. That colleague, Femi? He looks at you a certain way. I'd rather you kept it professional. You don't need to take that contract. It's beneath your level. I'll handle the shortfall." Each one alone was arguable. Reasonable even if you tilted your head the right way. It was only an accumulation, only when Amaka began to notice the shape they were making together, that the picture became clear. And by then, Chisholm had stopped calling. Not because anything happened, just because enough invitations had been declined that the invitations quietly stopped coming. Friendships, Amaka was learning, were not built to survive repeated absence. They didn't end dramatically. They simply dissolved, like salt in water. One day you looked up and the water was all there was. She stopped working on the notebook. Not consciously, not as a decision. It happened gradually, the way all significant losses happen, not all at once, but in small surrenders that only reveal their shape in retrospect. The wide corridors and open courtyards she used to sketch in the margins of everything began to feel frivolous. Adekunle had introduced her to a colleague who offered her a commission, a private residence, high-budget, specific brief. Clean lines. Enclosed. The client values privacy. She designed it exactly as instructed, and the colleague called it excellent. She looked at the finished plans and felt nothing. That was the moment she should have paid attention to. The blankness. The absence of the specific satisfaction that had always followed making something that felt true. She closed the folder and told herself she was tired. The fracture came on a Wednesday evening. She had mentioned, carefully, casually, with the particular caution she had developed without noticing she'd developed it, that a former classmate had recommended her for a junior partnership at a firm in Victoria Island. Good firm. Real opportunity. The kind that didn't come twice. Adekunle listened. Then he set down his fork and looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before. Not anger. Something more deliberate than anger. "Why would you need that?" he said slowly. "When everything you need is already provided?" Provided. The word landed somewhere behind her sternum and stayed there. She heard it, really heard it, for the first time in the full clarity of what it meant. Not supported. Not shared. Provided. The word you used for something that depended on you. Something that required management. She smiled and said she hadn't decided yet. But something behind her eyes had already decided. It didn't happen quickly after that. It never does. There were 3 more months of careful movement. Of keeping her face arranged into expressions she no longer meant. Of lying awake beside him while her mind measured distances. To the door, to the airport, to a life she could still barely remember wanting. She began to save. Carefully. In amounts small enough not to be noticed. She told no one. Because she understood, by then, that leaving him was not a conversation she could have with him. It was not a negotiation. It was not a breakup in the ordinary sense, the kind where two people acknowledge an ending and part with some residual dignity intact. Leaving Attacunnel was not a decision. It became survival. And the night she finally moved, packed one bag, left no note, walked out under the Lagos sky for the last time and did not look back. She felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief. Not yet. Just the strange, unfamiliar sensation of air in her lungs. Like breathing for the first time in a very long while. She had learned, living with Attacunnel, how to be invisible. How to move through a room without drawing attention to the movement. How to want something quietly in the part of herself she had learned to keep behind her face, without letting the wanting show. He had taught her that, without intending to. Surveillance does that. It trains you. And what he had built as a cage she was now carefully using as a tool. She planned the way she designed buildings. Methodically, in layers, starting with the structure before the surface. The account was at a different bank, one he had no knowledge of, in a branch far enough from their neighborhood that the chances of coincidence were low. She deposited in cash always. Small amounts, irregular intervals, nothing that would pattern into legibility if someone was paying attention. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself this every week for 4 months, and every week the voice saying it got quieter because she knew, with the specific knowledge of someone who had watched this man operate up close, that paranoid was probably not the right word. Prepared was the right word. She did not tell her mother. This was the hardest part. Harder than the silence, harder than the waiting. Because Ngozi would have worried, and worry on her mother's face was something Amaka found she could not bear. She told herself she would explain after. When there was distance enough that the explanation wouldn't require her mother to carry the fear of what might still happen. She told herself a lot of things in those 4 months, to get through them. The visa had been a separate project entirely. She had researched it in the architecture library at the university, on a desktop computer, not her phone, not the laptop Attacunnel had bought her, over 3 separate visits, each one brief enough to look like ordinary research. South Korea had a working holiday program, and beyond that, opportunities for skilled professionals. She had found a forum thread, expat women, some Nigerian, some not, talking about starting over in Seoul. Cold, someone had written. Lonely at first, but honest. The city doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. Amaka had read that line 3 times. She submitted the application on a Tuesday. The night she left was unremarkable by design. Attacunnel was in Abuja for the week, a logistics conference, 3 days, possibly 4. She had confirmed this without appearing to confirm it. She had counted the days and selected a Wednesday midweek, when absence would be least conspicuous. She packed 1 bag. Not her full wardrobe. He would notice missing things before he noticed a missing person if she cleared too much. 1 bag. Practical. Documents in a waterproof folder at the very bottom. Clothes she had bought herself with the saved money layered on top. Her worn notebook tucked against the side. She stood in the doorway of the flat for a moment. She did not look at the things on the shelves, the framed photos, the objects he had chosen for every surface. She looked at the ceiling. Wide and white and belonging to nobody. Then she walked out. She did not feel free. This was the thing no one told you, that escape in the moment of its execution did not feel like the opening of a door. It felt like holding your breath and running, with no certainty about where the running ended and no permission yet to exhale. The drive to the airport was 40 minutes. She watched Lagos pass through the taxi window, the hawkers and the yellow buses and the overpass lights smearing in the dark, and she felt something close to grief. Not for him. For the city. For the version of herself that had stood on these pavements and looked at open skies and believed she was building toward something. She was still building, she told herself. Just from scratch. Seoul arrived at 6 a.m., local time, in February. The cold was the first thing. Not the sharp, dramatic cold of film scenes. Just a persistent, matter-of-fact chill that settled into the gap between her coat and her scarf and stayed there, as though it had been waiting for exactly her. The airport was vast and efficient and gave nothing away. Signs she couldn't read. Announcements in sounds that had no purchase in her memory. She followed the international arrivals corridor and felt, for the first time since leaving Lagos, completely alone. Not lonely, alone. There was a difference, though in that moment it required effort to locate it. The first 3 months were an exercise in reduction. She found a room, small, 4th floor, no elevator, the window overlooking the rear wall of the building next door, through a listing board at a community center for foreign workers. She paid 3 months up front, which left her with just enough to survive the gap before income arrived. Income arrived slowly. The first job was at a dry cleaning facility near Itaewon. No Korean required beyond the basic phrases she memorized from a battered phrasebook she found at a second-hand stall. The hours were early and physical, and the other workers were polite in the careful way of people with whom you share no common language. She smiled. They smiled. The work got done. The second job came later, hostess at a hotel restaurant, 3 evenings a week, where the dress code required heels she hadn't planned for, and the work required the specific performance of warmth she was still learning to manufacture when she was tired. She studied between shifts. Not architecture yet, Korean first, because she understood instinctively what the city was telling her. That Seoul would offer things, eventually, to those who met it on its own terms. That integration here was not free. It was earned. She sat at the small desk under the window that looked at the other building's wall, and worked through vocabulary drills until her eyes wouldn't focus. Then slept 4 hours and began again. She did not call home often. When she did, she gave her mother the edited version, the one where Seoul was challenging but promising, where the work was temporary and the direction was clear. She was careful to sound tired in the right way, not the wrong way. Productive tired. Moving toward something tired. Not barely holding on tired. She was very good, by then, at keeping things behind her face. There were nights, more than she would later admit, when the smallness of the room felt indistinguishable from the smallness of the flat she had left. When the city outside the window, with its density and its signs she still couldn't fully read, pressed in with a weight that had no name. On those nights, she didn't let herself think about Lagos or Attacanal or the notebook or any of it. She thought about the expat forum post instead. The city doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. She could work with honesty. Honesty, at least, was something she could orient herself against. Something solid, something real, something that didn't shift when she wasn't looking. She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes. She was not free yet, but she was no longer in the cage. And for now, just for now, distance was enough. 2 years in Seoul, and Amaka had learned to read the city the way she once read buildings. Not the surface, the structure underneath. The way a neighborhood shifted from commercial to residential within half a block. One world folding quietly into another. The way certain streets were louder at certain hours, and the silence between the sounds was not emptiness but information. Seoul communicated through texture rather than declaration, and Amaka, who had spent years learning to read what people refused to say aloud, found she understood it. She had also, quietly, begun to build something. It had started small. A referral from a colleague at the hotel where she still worked 2 evenings a week. A contact who needed someone to consult on the interior redesign of a private members' lounge in Gangnam. Small project. Modest fee. But the result had drawn attention from the kind of people who notice things without announcing that they were noticing. Then a second commission. Then a third. By her 3rd year in Seoul, Amaka had left the dry cleaning facility, reduced her hotel evenings to 1, and was working almost entirely in interior design, a pivot from her architectural training that was, practically speaking, more accessible and, emotionally speaking, more manageable. Architecture required collaboration, institutions, systems she hadn't yet navigated. Interiors she could do with her hands, her eye, and her own judgment. Her work had developed a quality that clients struggled to name but consistently remarked on. Feels like somewhere you're allowed to breathe. There's no pressure in this room. I don't know what you did, but it doesn't feel like other spaces. Amaka knew what she had done. She had designed the way she always had, from the inside out. Every room was built around the question she had asked since her notebook years in Lagos. Does this space free the person inside it, or does it diminish them? She had simply stopped pretending that question was idealistic. The commission that changed things came through a firm she had done peripheral work for, a referral so removed from its origin point that Amaka couldn't trace it back to a single source. The brief was for a private estate redesign. High security. specific requirements around flow and spatial division. The client the firm's contact told her was private. She took the meeting. The address was a building in a part of the city she hadn't worked in before, the kind of neighborhood that communicated wealth not through excess but through the particular silence that only very serious money could afford to purchase. No noise from adjacent buildings. A lobby with nothing in it except a single arrangement of white flowers and a security desk staffed by a man who checked her credentials with the focused attention of someone accustomed to his job matching. She was shown to a meeting room. She waited. Do-yoon entered the way some people entered rooms, without announcement, without the social performance of arrival. One moment the room was empty of him. The next it was not. He was younger than she had expected. Mid-30s. Composed in a way that was not stillness so much as economy. No movement that wasn't purposeful, no expression deployed beyond what the moment required. He wore nothing that declared itself. Dark suit. No visible accessories. The kind of understated that cost more than the kind that announced itself. He sat across from her and placed her portfolio on the table. She hadn't seen him pick it up and opened it. He didn't introduce himself. He looked at her work. Not the way clients usually looked, scanning for reassurance, checking for signals that you understood their taste. He looked the way she looked when she was analyzing a space. Methodically, structurally. Moving through the pages with the patience of someone for whom conclusions were not something you rush toward. She waited. She had grown good at waiting. He turned to a project she considered minor, a small apartment redesign she'd included largely to show range. He looked at it for longer than the others. You open every space toward natural light, he said finally. His English was precise, accented, and gave the impression of a man who said exactly the words he intended. When the brief allows it, Amaka said. Even when it doesn't. He turned another page. You find a way. She didn't answer, because it was true and she hadn't decided yet what his noticing meant. He closed the portfolio, looked at her directly for the first time, not appraisingly, not with the particular sliding quality she had learned to recognize and brace against. He looked at her the way he had looked at the work, analytically. As though she were a space with information in it he was interested in understanding. You design like someone who has survived confinement, he said. The sentence landed without warning. Not because it was unkind, because it was precise. The specific precision of being seen accurately by someone you had just met, the vertigo of it, the exposure of it moved through her before she could arrange her face around it. She met his eyes. The work gets better for it, he said. Simply, as though he were stating something architectural, not personal. Then he looked back at the portfolio. I'd like you to take the commission. He did not ask about her life outside the work. He did not ask where she was from, or how long she had been in Seoul, or any of the questions that functioned socially as requests for access. He asked about load-bearing walls and the Eastern Wing's relationship to morning light and whether she had a position on the use of interior courtyards. She had a very strong position on interior courtyards. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once. Not the performative nod of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but the nod of someone actually filing something away. Good, he said. She worked on the estate for 4 months. She saw Do-yoon on average once a week, sometimes less. He reviewed progress with the focused brevity of someone who trusted the person he had hired and had no interest in performing oversight for its own sake. He asked precise questions. He accepted precise answers. He did not fill silence with conversation that served no function. The silence was the thing she noticed first. And then, as weeks passed, the thing she began to recognize. In other rooms, silence had been a warning. The particular quiet before a correction. A cold look. An instruction she was expected to anticipate. She had spent 2 years recalibrating, learning slowly that silence in Seoul was simply the absence of sound, not the presence of threat. But Do-yoon's silence was something further than neutral. It was, she realized one afternoon while reviewing plans in the estate's eastern sitting room, generous. He created it deliberately, space in which she could exist without having to manage anyone's perception of her existence. She hadn't known, until it was offered, that she had been waiting for that. She sat with the plans in the quiet room and the October light coming through the windows she had repositioned by 40 degrees, and she felt something she didn't immediately name. Only later, walking home, did she recognize it. Safety. Not rescue. Not protection offered by someone positioning themselves between her and the world. Just space. Enough space to stand in without having to make herself smaller. It was, she thought, the most generous thing anyone had given her in a very long time. Healing, Amaka discovered, did not announce itself. It didn't arrive on a specific morning with a change in light or a sudden loosening in the chest. It arrived the way the seasons arrived in Seoul, incrementally, almost argumentatively, winter conceding ground to spring 1 degree at a time, the change only visible in retrospect when you looked back and realized the cold had quietly become something else. She noticed it first in small things. She stopped checking the door. This had been a habit so embedded she had forgotten it was a habit. The glance toward exits when she entered rooms, the precise awareness of who was between her and the nearest way out. It had begun in the last year with Adekunal, that reflex, and it had followed her through Lagos and the airport and the 4th floor room in Itaewon and every client meeting since. One afternoon, she was in a consultation with a new client, a gallery owner in Mapogu who spoke carefully considered English and had very specific ideas about negative space, and she realized, somewhere in the second hour, that she had not once located the exit. She had simply been in the room. She finished the meeting, walked to the subway, stood on the platform, and allowed herself quietly to count it. The eye contact returned next. Not the performed kind, the deliberate steadiness she had taught herself as a professional skill, the meeting of eyes that was really a form of careful management. The real kind. The kind where you looked at someone and didn't simultaneously calculate how the looking was landing, whether it was too direct, whether it was inviting a response she would have to navigate. She noticed it first with a contractor she worked with regularly. A meticulous man named Park who communicated largely in measurements and raised eyebrows and had the professional reliability she had come to value more than conversation. They were reviewing a materials delivery one morning and he said something that surprised her and she laughed, genuinely without editing the laugh first, and looked directly at him while she laughed. He looked slightly startled, then smiled. She walked home thinking, that used to be easier. I had forgotten it used to be easier. The work expanded. The estate commission had generated referrals in the way that significant work in private circles generates referrals. Not publicly, not through visible channels, but through the particular network of people who attend the same events and trust the same taste. She just stood there and let the light come through the windows and thought, this is what the inside of the notebook looks like. Do-yoon remained consistent in the way that reliable infrastructure was consistent, present, functional, unobtrusive. After the estate commission concluded, he had referred her twice more to projects within his extended network. He had attended one site review in that time, asked 3 questions, and left without staying for the tea the client offered. He checked in occasionally, not frequently enough to constitute contact in the social sense. A message about a project timeline. A question about a material she had specified. Once, anomalously, a message that said only, the Eastern sitting room is exactly right. She had looked at that message for a long time before responding. Thank you, she had written. I know. What she understood about Do-yoon by now was that his consistency was itself a form of communication. He did not perform reliability. He was simply reliable in the way that structures were reliable, not because they announced their integrity but because they remained standing. She had spent enough time around men whose steadiness was a performance, deployed to lower defenses, that she had learned to recognize the real thing by its lack of effort. He never asked her for more than the work required. He never made his presence something she had to manage. She filed this information the way she filed structural data, not emotionally, not yet, but carefully, accurately. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Printed card, delivered physically to her studio, a detail she noted because almost nothing arrived physically anymore. The paper was heavy, the typeface understated. The cultural center of contemporary exchange, it read, was pleased to invite her to the annual International Patrons Dinner, an event celebrating significant contributors to Seoul's arts and architecture sector. Her name was on it. Amaka Obi, Interior Design. Suah had placed it on her desk without comment, which meant she had recognized it was significant and chosen, wisely, to let Amaka encounter it without an audience. Amaka picked it up. Read it twice. She thought about the girl who had eaten small chops at a networking event she hadn't been supposed to attend, because the air conditioning was free. She thought about the fourth-floor room with the window that looked at a wall. She thought about the Tuesday mornings in the transfer office, sending money home in amounts that felt shameful for how small they were. She set the card back on the desk. This was what survival looked like when it had been given enough time to become something else. This was proof, the kind that didn't require anyone else's confirmation, that she had not just escaped. She had arrived. She called her mother that evening. She didn't mention the invitation immediately. They talked about Amaka, who was now at university and apparently developing opinions about economics that Ngozi found exhausting. They talked about the neighborhood and the generator situation, and a wedding that had happened 2 weeks ago involving people Amaka only vaguely remembered. At the end of the call, she mentioned it. Briefly, there's a dinner, a significant one. I've been invited as a recognized contributor. Her mother was quiet for a moment. I knew, Ngozi said finally. You knew what? That the sky would keep being the sky. A pause. No matter how long someone made you look at the ground. Amaka pressed her lips together. She said good night. She set the phone down. She looked at the invitation on the desk, and then at the east-facing windows, and then at the dark Seoul skyline beyond them. Dense and lit and indifferent and, for the first time in a long time, completely unthreatening. She was going to the dinner. She didn't know yet who else would be there. She didn't know yet that the past had received an invitation too. The dress was emerald. She had chosen it deliberately, not for the color, which was simply one she had always worn well, but for the cut. Clean lines. Nothing excessive. The kind of dress that communicated arrival without announcing it, which was, she had come to understand, exactly how she wanted to occupy space now. Not loudly, just completely. Suah had seen her leave the studio that evening and said, with the particular sincerity of someone who had not yet learned to be restrained about such things, "You look like someone who built something." Amaka had smiled the whole way to the venue. The cultural center sat in the kind of neighborhood that Seoul reserved for institutions it took seriously. A broad stone building, lit for the occasion in warm white, the entrance flanked by arrangements of white orchids in tall black vessels. Cars arrived in a measured procession. Attendees moved through the entrance with the practiced ease of people for whom events like this were not occasions but simply Thursdays. Amaka was not one of those people yet. She might never be entirely. She had decided she didn't mind. The interior was everything the invitation had implied. High ceilings, the kind of lighting that flattered everyone equally and therefore felt generous rather than designed. Round tables dressed in linen the color of winter cream. The room held perhaps 200 people, arranged in the loosely deliberate clustering of those who knew each other well enough to circulate without agenda. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She rarely drank at professional events, a habit she had developed in the early Seoul years when she needed to be fully conscious at all times, and had simply never abandoned, and began the careful navigation of the room. She knew some faces, nodded to a developer she had worked with peripherally, stopped to speak with a curator from the Liam who had been on the periphery of a commission last year, found herself in a conversation about sustainable materials with 2 architects from a firm she respected, and realized somewhere in the middle of it that she was not performing confidence. She simply had it. This was new enough that she noticed it. Not the surface version she had worn like professional equipment through the difficult years, the squared shoulders, the direct eye contact, the voice calibrated to suggest certainty even when the room beneath it was less certain. This was structural. She knew what she was talking about. She had earned the right to be in this room, and her body, apparently, had received the update. She moved through the evening with something close to ease. The speeches began at 8. She was seated at a table near the center of the room, an intentional placement she understood. The organizers seated contributors by significance, and she had been positioned accordingly, which still carried the faint unreality of something she hadn't fully absorbed. Around her were an economist, a film producer, and a landscape architect from Busan whose work she had admired for 2 years and said so, and who responded with a directness she found immediately refreshing. The speeches were the usual architecture of such events. Gratitude, vision, acknowledgement of the past year's contributions. Her name was read aloud during the contributor's acknowledgement, along with a brief description of her work, and there was applause, and she received it without looking at the table, which was something she had had to practice. The applause faded. The evening resumed. She exhaled. It was 40 minutes later, during the transition between the formal program and dinner service, when the room loosened into movement. People rising to refresh drinks, circulate, find their way to different conversations. That something shifted in the quality of the air. She didn't know what made her look up. Not a sound. Not a movement that distinguished itself from the general movement of the room. Something less definable than either, the particular instinct that develops in people who have spent significant time in states of heightened alertness. The body's intelligence operating below conscious thought. She looked toward the entrance. He was standing just inside the doorway. He had not yet seen her, or had not yet indicated that he had seen her, which with Adekunle were never the same thing. He was dressed impeccably. Of course, that had always been precise, the appearance of a man who understood that presentation was its own form of power. He was speaking to someone near the door, his posture carrying that familiar ease, that quality of settled confidence she had once mistaken for the hallmark of a good man rather than the hallmark of a man who had never encountered a situation he couldn't control. Her hand, she noticed, had stopped moving. Her glass was halfway to her lips and had simply stopped. She set it down carefully. The room continued around her. Conversation, laughter, the musical arrangement playing below the level of speech. Everything proceeding with the smooth momentum of an event designed to feel effortless. No one near her had noticed anything, because there was nothing yet to notice. Just a woman who had gone still. Just a man across a room who hadn't turned yet. She watched him work the conversation at the door. The small laugh, the hand briefly on an arm, the practiced fluency of someone who had spent decades understanding that people were resources to be managed through charm before they were managed through other means. She knew that fluency. She had watched it operate at close range on herself, until she understood the mechanics well enough to have built her exit around them. He is here, she thought. He is actually here. Not a nightmare iteration. Not the version of him she still encountered occasionally in the suspended logic of early morning before full wakefulness arrived. The real one. Solid and present and 20 meters away in a room that, until 40 seconds ago, had represented everything she had built to prove she was no longer within his reach. Her jaw was tight. She made it soften. That was still there, the physical management, the trained composure. At least there was that. And then, across the width of the room, across the candlelit tables and the moving figures and the low architecture of polite conversation, he turned. His eyes found her the way she had always suspected they would if this moment ever came, without searching. Directly, as though he had known exactly where she was standing since he walked through the door, and had simply been deciding when to confirm it. He looked at her. She looked back. The room did not change. The music continued. No one turned. The evening proceeded with perfect indifference to the fact that something had just fractured. He smiled. Slow. Recognizing. The smile of a man who had spent years being told a thing was lost and had just confirmed it was not. The past had found her again. And this time it had dressed for the occasion. He crossed the room the way he had always moved through spaces he considered his. Without hesitation. Without the social consideration of someone aware they might be unwelcome. Adekunle had never learned to read a room as a place that could refuse him. He read rooms only for what they contained and what could be extracted, and so he moved through this one the same way he had moved through every room she had ever watched him enter. Like it already belonged to him. Amaka did not run. She had thought, in the abstract version of this moment she had rehearsed without meaning to across 3 years and 7,000 kilometers, that she would run. That the body would override the mind and make the decision before the mind could argue with it. But she was not the same body that had walked out of a Lagos flat with one bag and a waterproof folder. She stayed where she was. Amaka! He said her name the way he had always said it, with the particular emphasis of someone who understood that naming a thing was a form of claiming it. Warm on the surface. Certain underneath. I thought that was you. He stopped 2 feet from her, and his eyes moved over her. The dress, the room placement, the name badge she was wearing from the contributor's acknowledgement, and she watched him process it. The calculation behind the familiar face. You've done well for yourself. Adekunal. She kept her voice level. You should leave. He smiled. I was invited. Then you should stay away from me. We're at the same event. He tilted his head slightly, that gesture she remembered, the one that preceded the reframing of her reality into something he found more convenient. Don't make it dramatic. She turned to move away. His hand closed around her wrist. Not violent. Not yet, not here, not in a room full of people. Just firm. The specific firmness of someone reminding you of a fact they consider settled. We're not finished, he said quietly. We have been finished, Amaka said. For 3 years. You left without a conversation. Still quiet. Still reasonable in register, unreasonable in content. She recognized this mode, had spent months learning its architecture. That's not how it works. Let go of my wrist. He didn't. And then, because he had always known how to use an audience even when he appeared to be ignoring it, he raised his voice. Not to a shout. Just enough to carry. Just enough to draw the peripheral attention of the nearest tables, the nearest conversations, the nearest eyes. You think this? He gestured with his free hand at the room. The name badge, all of it. You think any of this would exist without what I gave you? I paid for the foundation, Amaka. Every brick of whatever you think you've built. The nearest conversations had stopped. Heads had turned. She felt it, the exposure of being looked at, the specific humiliation of being made into a scene in a room where she had 20 minutes ago been applauded. The heat of it. The old familiar contraction, the pull toward smallness, toward management, toward making it stop by any available means. She did not contract. But before she could speak, before she could locate the words she had earned the right to say, he reached past her. A glass of red wine from the table behind her. And she understood what was happening 1 second before it did. The wine came slowly, deliberately, over her head, down through her hair, spreading across the emerald fabric in a dark, blooming stain. The sound it made, the small sound of liquid on silk, was somehow louder than anything else in the room. Complete silence followed it. You still belong to me, Adekunal said, quietly, for her alone. She was on her knees. She hadn't registered the falling, only the arriving, the marble floor cold through the soaked fabric of her dress. Her ears were ringing. Her vision had gone briefly white and returned. She was aware of the room, of the watching, of 200 people witnessing the most precise replication of everything she had spent 3 years escaping. She pressed one hand to the floor. She was getting up. She was getting up, and then the room changed, not loudly. Not with any of the signals that typically announced a change in power. No raised voice, no sudden movement, just a presence that arrived beside her with the particular quality of something that had been there, waiting, watching, deciding, for longer than anyone had realized. Do-yoon. He didn't look at her first. He looked at Adekunal. The look was brief and total, the kind of assessment that took in everything relevant and discarded the rest in under 2 seconds, and then was finished. Not angry. Not threatened. Done. Let her go, he said. His voice was quiet, the quiet that had nothing to prove. Adekunal looked at him with the expression of a man encountering an obstacle he hasn't yet categorized. Who are you supposed to be? The question landed and dissipated, unanswered. Do-yoon didn't explain himself. He looked at the hand still gripping Amaka's arm, then back at Adekunal's face. You've touched something, he said. That no longer belongs to you. A beat. Something shifted in the room. Not among everyone, but among the people who knew. And there were people here who knew. Who had gone still in a different way than the others. A specific stillness that recognized rather than simply observed. Adekunal either didn't see it or chose not to. She belongs to herself, he said, with the familiar fluency of a man reframing a situation mid-sentence. She always. He didn't finish, because the men had already moved. She didn't see where they had come from. Later, she would not be able to reconstruct it, the geometry of their arrival, the positions they had occupied before they were needed. They were simply there. 3 of them, arranged with the quiet precision of people who had rehearsed nothing because rehearsal implied uncertainty. There was no confrontation. No struggle. Adekunal's grip on her arm released. Not voluntarily, but without drama, without noise, without the spectacle he would have preferred. He was guided toward the door the way a problem is guided toward its resolution. Firmly, completely, without the courtesy of acknowledgement. The doors opened. He was outside. The doors closed. The room breathed. Do-yoon turned to her. She was on her feet. She had stood somewhere in the preceding 30 seconds. She wasn't entirely sure when. Her dress was soaked. Her hair was ruined. She was aware, distantly, of all of it. She was also aware that she was not shaking. That felt important. He looked at her. Not at the dress, not at the damage, not at the spectacle of what the room had just witnessed. Her. The same way he had looked at her work the first time. As though the relevant information was interior, not surface. "What do you want?" he asked. Not what he intended to do. Not what she should do. What she wanted. The question landed in the specific place that questions almost never reached anymore. The place she had learned to keep unreachable. The place where what she actually needed lived behind everything practical and managed and survivable. Her voice shook once. Then it didn't. "I want my life back." He held her gaze. "You never lost it," he said quietly. "He just made you forget it was yours." He took off his jacket, no ceremony, no production, and placed it over her shoulders. Not possessively, practically. The gesture of someone who had identified a specific need and addressed it. Then he stood beside her, and faced the room and waited. Not in front of her, beside her. And the room, which had watched Adekunal try to reduce her to something manageable, now watched something different entirely. A woman standing upright, wine-stained and composed, next to a man who had not rescued her, who had simply made space for her to stand. 8 months later, the building was finished. She stood across the street from it on a Tuesday morning. Tuesday still meant something to her. She had stopped fighting that, and looked at what she had made. Not with the anxious audit of someone searching for errors. With the steady, full-chested look of someone who had built a thing exactly as she meant to build it, and was now simply confirming that fact. The Saebyeok Center. New Dawn in Korean. Suah had suggested it, quietly, during a late session when they had been debating names, and Amaka had looked at her across the drafting table and said yes without deliberating. Some things didn't need deliberation. The building was not large. She had resisted every suggestion that it should be, from the funding board, from 2 of the 3 investors, from the architect she had brought in as a structural consultant who kept using the phrase "make a statement." She understood the instinct. Statements had their place. But this was not that kind of building. This was the kind of building that should feel, to the woman walking through its doors for the first time, like a place that had been expecting her. Not impressive. Not institutional. Not the cold, managed grace of spaces designed to process people efficiently and call it care. She had designed it from the inside out the way she had always designed, starting with the question of what the person inside would need, and working outward until the exterior was simply the honest expression of that answer. The entrance was wide and unhurried, no narrow corridor, no reception desk positioned as a checkpoint. Just an open threshold that moved you naturally into a central courtyard, because she had decided early that the first thing a woman arriving here should experience was sky. Open sky directly overhead, unobstructed, belonging to no one. The courtyard was the building's center in every sense. Rooms arranged around it rather than in rows, each one accessible from the open air, each one with windows that faced outward and inward, so that the courtyard was always visible, always available, always there as evidence that the outside world was not a threat to be managed but a fact to be inhabited. No locked doors. This had been the one point on which she had been, in the polite and final way she had learned to be immovable, completely immovable. Every room accessible. Every exit visible. Every space designed so that the person inside it could always see a way out. Not because leaving was the point, but because knowing you could leave was the difference between a room and a cell. The funding board had questioned this. She had explained it once, and then declined to explain it again, and they had eventually conceded to a woman whose certainty on the matter was clearly structural rather than decorative. The center offered transitional housing, legal support, counseling, and skills development for women in the process of rebuilding their lives. It had been in planning since the month after the gala, since the week she had sat in Do-yoon's estate, in the eastern sitting room with the repositioned windows, and asked herself what she would have needed at 27 if someone had thought to provide it. She had written the answer down. Then she had called Sua and told her to clear the next 6 months. She had not rebuilt alone. She knew this and had stopped qualifying it as weakness. Do-yoon had provided the initial capital, not as a gift, not with the suffocating grammar of charity, but as an investment with a written agreement and a repayment structure she had designed herself, because those terms mattered to her and he had understood, without requiring explanation, why they mattered. He had attended 2 site visits, asked 4 questions across the 8 months, sent 1 message when the structural shell was complete, a photograph she had sent him of the courtyard framing, sky visible above the unfinished walls, and his response had been, "This is right." She had known what he meant. He was here today, somewhere behind her. She hadn't turned to confirm it, but she knew. She had learned over these months the specific quality of his presence. The way space arranged itself differently when he was in it. Not intrusively, just with more structure, like a load-bearing wall that didn't call attention to what it was holding up. She would turn around eventually. Not yet. The opening had happened this morning, small, intentional, without press. The women who would be the center's first residents had walked through the entrance in the early light, and Amaka had stood in the courtyard and watched them look up. Every one of them had looked up. She had not planned for that, had not known she was watching for it until it happened, the involuntary upward tilt of faces encountering open sky in a space that had been designed to offer it freely. The brief pause before moving forward. She had had to look at the ground for a moment. Then she had looked up too. Now the street was quiet. The morning had moved into itself, unhurried. Somewhere in the building behind her, Sua was managing the operational details with the efficient warmth she brought to everything, and the first day was proceeding without her. It didn't need her to proceed. She had built it to work without her presence holding it together. That had been the point. She thought about the girl in Lagos who had sketched wide corridors and open courtyards in a soft-paged notebook and called her philosophy freedom and been told it was idealistic. She thought about the flat she had left with 1 bag. The 4th-floor room in Itaewon with the window that looked at a wall. The Tuesday mornings in the transfer office. The wine in her hair. The marble floor under her palms. She thought about every room that had pressed down on her, and every ceiling that had been positioned to remind her she was contained. She looked at the building she had made. Open spaces. Tall windows. A courtyard with nothing above it but sky. This, she thought, is what I was designing the whole time. I just didn't know yet what it was for. She tilted her head back. The Seoul sky in October was the particular shade of blue that had no apology in it. Clear and direct. The same quality of light she had grown up under in Lagos. The light that landed without flattery and showed everything as it was. She had stood under both skies and felt small. She stood under this one and did not. Not because the sky had changed. Because she understood now what she had been looking for. All those evenings she had stopped on the pavement and looked up. In Lagos, on the way home from the studio, before Atakunnel, before any of it. She had been looking for confirmation that some things couldn't be owned. She had been right. The sky couldn't be owned. And neither, it turned out, could she. Not by a man who confused possession with love. Not by a past that had followed her across an ocean. Not by fear or poverty or isolation, or any of the specific weights she had carried and set down and sometimes picked up again before finally, learning to leave them on the ground. Freedom, she understood now, had never been a destination. It was not Seoul or the studio, or the invitation with the heavy paper, or even this building across the street with its open courtyard and its unlocked doors. Freedom was the thing she had been carrying the whole time, through every room that tried to take it, the part of herself that kept drawing open spaces even when she was living in closed ones, the part that had survived every version of not enough and kept designing anyway. She breathed in the October air. Behind her, unhurried and undemanding, Do-yoon waited, not for her to become something, just for her to finish looking at the sky. She took one more moment, gave it to herself, fully, without guilt, and then she turned around. She was ready. There was more to build.